I don't think it's going to come as any great shock for me to begin this second lecture by asking this question. What happened to the dinosaurs? I noticed that some of you were so terribly distraught at not having the answer that it radically affected your appetite. What happened to the dinosaurs? There are well over 25 different scientific theories to explain the ultimate extinction and demise of those wondrous creatures. Some of the theories you might well be able to put into a category that you would label possible. Some of the theories you might put into a category labeled as probable. And to be sure, some of them you could put into a category labeled as pitiful. I don't think this afternoon I'll have a whole lot of trouble giving you a sampling of just about all those categories. My guess is that many of you are familiar with the theory that's been making the rounds for the last 5 to 7 years. It was set forth a number of years ago by the late Nobel laureate Dr. Luis Alvarez and his son, Dr. Walter Alvarez. The Alvarez's theory suggests, by way of summary, this: that there was a huge asteroid well over 6 miles in diameter that actually penetrated the Earth's upper atmosphere, impacted with the Earth, and caused global devastation in the process. The theory suggests that first, huge amounts of dust were thrown up into the upper atmosphere from the impact itself. Secondly, the impact caused global forest fires that literally leapt from one continent to the next, causing huge amounts of soot and ash to be thrown up into the upper atmosphere as well. Those three things, the soot, the ash, the dust, formed an envelope of sorts around the Earth that blocked out very effectively the sun's rays. Dinosaurs are reptiles. Reptiles are cold-blooded. Cold-blooded animals, in order to maintain their body temperatures, have to draw their temperature from the environment. But the theory suggests the temperatures on the Earth fell so low for so long, the dinosaurs couldn't maintain their body temperatures in that environment, and as a result, froze to death, becoming extinct in the process. That's one theory. There are 24 others. For example, there's a theory that says there was a flood, a famine, worldwide on the Earth for reasons as yet unknown. And that during this famine, the dinosaurs were forced to move farther and farther from their nests in order to forage for food. And as they moved away from those nests, other animals, similarly in search of food, came to their unprotected nests, found their eggs, broke them open, and ate them to sustain their own lives, but in so doing, robbed the dinosaurs of the ability to sustain their lives through procreation. And with no progeny, they became extinct. Or you may wish to add this theory to your list. It was set forth a number of years ago by a scientist who was in attendance at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He referred to it as the Zonk theory. He said what he believed actually happened was this: that a huge asteroid attempted to impact with the Earth but was unsuccessful in doing so. It broke apart when it hit the Earth's upper atmosphere. However, he said, it broke apart into grapefruit-sized balls that did make it through the atmosphere and zonked the dinosaurs on the head, and they all died. I'll leave you to decide which of those three previous categories that should go in: possible, probable, or pitiful. Friends, there's no shortage of theories about what happened to these wondrous animals. What we have is a shortage of facts. This afternoon, I'd like to set forth for your consideration a theory from the creationist viewpoint that I personally believe fits the available biblical and scientific evidence much, much better than any of the other 24 or 25. Very rare in the creation-evolution controversy that creationists and evolutionists agree. In fact, I suppose it's the nature of the beast. that we're always going to disagree. But there is one area, believe it or not, on which we all are in very strong agreement, and that's this. The earth on which we now are living is nothing like the earth used to be. If I were to give you the name today of Charles Darwin, wouldn't it be safe for me to say that almost everybody in here would easily recognize that name? But if I were to give you the name of a good friend of Darwin's, contemporary of his, scientist of renown in his own right, would you just as easily recognize the name of Alfred Russel Wallace? Probably not. And there's some irony in that. You see, at the same time Darwin was hatching his idea of evolution by natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace was hatching his idea of evolution by natural selection. In fact, he even wrote Darwin a letter about it. Darwin got the letter, was fearful somebody was going to beat him to the punch. He had spent 20 years of his life on this. So he rapidly got into print that famous little book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, making certain his name was elevated to the status of a demigod, while the name of Alfred Russel Wallace was relegated to the relic heaps of history. But this afternoon, I'd like to show you a statement that was made by Mr. Wallace. He said, "There is but one climate known to the ancient fossil world as revealed by the plants and animals entombed in the rocks. And that climate," he said, "was a mantle of spring-like loveliness that seems to have prevailed over the whole globe. Just how the world may have been this warm all over may be a matter of conjecture," said Mr. Wallace. "That it was so warm, effectively and continuously, is a matter of fact." I'd like you to key in this afternoon on that phrase, mantle of spring-like loveliness, that seems to have prevailed continuously over the whole globe. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the one point on which the creationists and evolutionists are in complete agreement. If you, during your school day studies, remember reading about or reading the actual journals of Admirals Byrd and Perry, who investigated the South and North Poles respectively, you may recall that those two admirals, scientists in their own right, wrote in those journals about how they could stand at the North Pole, the South Pole, cast their eyes down and see that beneath the ice on which they were standing were embedded fruit trees, palm trees, and other lush tropical to subtropical types of vegetation at the North and South Poles. Do you remember that one piece of information I asked you at the 1 o'clock lecture to file away? I told you it would become very important at the 3:30 lecture. Well, here's where it becomes important. How much vegetation does it take to make coal? A lot. 10 feet of compressed vegetation make 1 single foot of peat. 12 feet of compressed peat to make 1 single foot of coal. Folks, it takes a whopping large amount of vegetation to make coal. Where is the world's largest single coal deposit to be found? The answer? Antarctica. Under that southernmost continent is the world's largest single coal deposit. What does that tell you that pristine southernmost continent has not always been? Hasn't been a vast frozen wasteland, has it? Mr. Wallace is absolutely right. There was a time in the distant past where this whole globe enjoyed a mantle of spring-like loveliness. 2 questions spring to mind. Number 1, what caused that? And number 2, what changed that? Do you recall during God's creative activity, recorded early on in Genesis 1, it plainly states that he separated the waters beneath the firmament from the waters above the firmament. Do you remember that phraseology? That word firmament in the original Hebrew language is this word. It's the Hebrew word rakia. It simply means the sky above the earth. What would the waters beneath the sky be? Wouldn't that be the waters here on the earth? Rivers, lakes, streams, fjords, oceans, seas? What would the phrase waters above the earth represent? I would like to suggest for your consideration this afternoon the possibility that the Genesis record is talking about a watery, mist-like canopy that was in place above the entire earth shortly after its creation. And ladies and gentlemen, if that canopy were in fact in place, there is no denying it would have had several effects, positive effects, upon this planet. Number one, today the sun's rays that come to us hit the earth and bounce back out into space. But in that day and age, if the canopy were in place, they would have hit the earth to bounce back, but when they hit the bottom of that mist-like watery canopy, some of them at least, would ricochet to come back down to this planet to, in essence, be recycled. Thus, in the process, raising the temperature of the globe worldwide. The average temperature of the world today, the average, is 53 degrees Fahrenheit. In that day, it would have been much higher. Secondly, remember that today the sun's rays that come to us come through an ozone layer that effectively filters them. And that's good for us because many of those rays, the harsh UV rays, can damage our skin, give us melanomas and skin cancers and so on. But folks, think about it. If in that day and age you had a double filtration system in effect, not only the canopy, but the ozone layer beyond the canopy, those rays would have been filtered all the more effectively, making this planet a much safer place to live in the long run. Thirdly, add this to all that we've discussed thus far. Remember that when God created the earth, he pronounced it very good. Friends, it wasn't just the Garden of Eden that was perfect. Now, it's true, that garden was a lush, tropical paradise, the likes of which we'll never on this earth see again. But it was not just the Garden of Eden that was perfect. The entire world was perfect. Those people had a pristine water supply, a perfect food supply, unpolluted air, and all around them it was perfect. Today we've become, haven't we, our own worst enemies. We didn't know when we dumped DDT into the environment a generation ago it was going to mutate the gene pool, but it did. We didn't know when we dumped Agent Orange on soldiers to defoliate forests so they could fight battles that it was going to mutate the gene pool, but it did. We didn't know when we fed our women a generation ago thalidomide as a tranquilizer it would mutate the gene pool, but it did. We didn't realize when we filled our buildings, schools, factories with asbestos that it would mutate the gene pool, but it did. Today, we carry over 1,300 genetic mutations in the human gene pool, none of which is good for us. In that day and age, however, they would have had none. They were created by God perfect. Pristine foods, perfect waters, unpolluted airs. There were no factories spewing the chemicals into their rivers and streams and air that pollute those rivers and streams and make acid rain from the air. Friends, they literally inhabited a perfect world. Tell me something. All of that being true, why is it the people in that day and age could not have lived much longer than we do today? And doesn't the Bible indicate that's exactly what happened? If I were to ask the youngsters in the auditorium today, I suspect most of them could answer the first part of this question, and maybe some of them the second. Who, according to the Bible, was the oldest man ever to have lived on the face of the earth? Methuselah. And how old was he when he died? Genesis 5:27 records that he was 969 years old when he died. Genesis 5:5 says that Adam lived to be 930 years old, and then he died. Here's an interesting exercise for you. Go home today, take the average ages, take the ages of all the patriarchs and average them. Enoch, of course, being accepted because he never died but was translated directly to heaven. You know the figure you'll get? 912. That was the average. Folks, what's going on here? Today, think about this. Today, you live to be 100 years old, you get a letter on the official stationery of the White House signed by the then elected President of the United States. And more importantly, Willard Scott calls your name on the morning weather. I mean, you're talking about a really big deal here to live to be 100. Folks, 100, these people were living to be 912 years old on the average. What's going on here? Does anybody in here remember the story of Abraham and Sarah going down into the country of Gerar? And there they were going to meet a king by the name of Abimelech. And what did Abraham tell Sarah about that trip? He said, now, if we get down there and somebody from the king's palace sees you and your beauty and they want to put you in his harem, you just tell them, I'm your brother. I'll tell them, you're my sister. Because if they find out I'm your husband, they may just kill me and take you and put you in his harem anyway. And I'm not real keen on that idea. So they got down, and sure enough, somebody from the king's palace spotted this woman. Her beauty apparently attracted them, and they said, well, now, who's this? And Abraham said, oh, that's my sister. You know, she was his half-sister. So some people have suggested that was a half-lie. I think that's like being a little bit pregnant. No such thing, huh, ladies? But do you recall what happened, folks? Abimelech took her, and God came to Abimelech in a vision, and he warned him, he said, if you touch her, you are like a dead man. Folks, the original Hebrew language indicates a very violent, disgusting death yet to befall this king. And Abimelech said, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't know. And he said, take her back. So Abimelech took her back. None of which is my point. My point is, did you ever stop to calculate the age of this ravishingly beautiful woman sought after by one of the most powerful men on the face of the earth? She was 90 years old at the time. 90. Hope springs eternal, eh? 90 years old and ravishingly beautiful. Friends, what's going on here? What's going on is things back then were totally different than they are today. These people didn't have any mutations in their gene pool. They had a pristine food supply, perfect water supply, unpolluted air supply. Why in the world couldn't they live to be vast ages? There's another question that ties right into this. And by the way, what I'm trying to do this afternoon is show you a singular golden thread that weaves its way very cautiously, very conspicuously through all this material. At first, these may seem to you like disparate, unconnected, unrelated events. They're not. They're all tied together by this beautiful golden thread. Watch it continue. Did you ever wonder, where did Cain get his wife? Oh, I see a lot of heads shaking up and down. Folks, I'm asked that question all the time. People go, where did Cain get his wife? Well, let me lay before you three options very quickly, and let's take a look at them. Number one, could God, if he had so desired, just have created some other folks and put them out there for Cain, and he made his way over and found one of them and married her? Or number two, the Bible plainly says, does it not, that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters? Maybe one of Cain's brothers married one of Cain's sisters, produced a female offspring, which would have been his niece, And he simply waited until she became of marrying age, and then he married his niece. Now, granted, there would have been a vast age difference between the two of them, but let's face it, when you're going to live to be 900 plus years old, waiting a couple of hundred years to get married is no big deal, so to speak. Or thirdly, maybe Cain married a sister. So let's examine each of those very quickly. Did you notice how carefully I worded the first one? I said, could God, if he had so desired, have created some folks and put them out there? Could he have done that? Sure he could have. That's the wrong question, friends. The question is, did he do that? And the answer is, no, he did not. How do we know? When Adam looked at Eve right after her creation, do you remember he said two things about her? She's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I'll call her name woman, for she was taken out of man. The Hebrew word for man is the little word ish. The word for woman is the word ishah, meaning literally, out of man. But Adam also said, she shall be the mother of all living. Folks, the name Adam means of the red earth. The name Eve means life giver. She was going to be the mother of all living. The first option is unscriptural. You can toss it out. What about the second one? Could God have created could God have allowed Adam and Eve to have other sons and daughters, which the text indicates that he did, and then one of those daughters married one of the brothers, produced a female that was to Cain and niece? Could he have married his niece? Yes, he could have. I couldn't disprove that to you today if my life depended on it. That forever will remain an open option. But I'd like to suggest to you this afternoon that from a straightforward timeline reading of the text, the most likely of these three options is the third one, that Cain actually married a sister. Now today, if you say that in an auditorium like this, where there are any teenage boys present who have sisters, you get one immediate response. But marry your sister? They can't even imagine somebody else marrying their sister. I'm sorry, girls, that's just the way we guys are, okay? But folks, think about it a minute. Today, in our 20th century context, when you say marry a sister, first word pops to mind is incest. And we all know that in civilized countries, America certainly included in that number, incest by social sanction or law or both is forbidden. Example, in all 50 states of America and all of her possessions, incest between a mother and a son, a father and a daughter, a brother and a sister is by law illegal. And in some of the 50 states and possessions, first cousin intermarriages remain illegal as well. Why? Do we make those laws, activate those injunctions because we just don't like it? No. It has nothing to do with what we like or dislike, does it? Folks, it has to do with those 1,300 genetic mutations I mentioned earlier. We're carrying around those 1,300 in the human genome. None of them is any good for us. If you allow very close marriages to take place between relatives and offspring are the result, those mutations can be expressed in the offspring, damaging our children or even killing them. We don't want that for them or for us, so we forbid it. But think about it. In this early time after creation, canopy possibly in place, no mutations in the gene pool, a perfect water, food supply, perfect environment. Why couldn't these people intermarry and have offspring via very close relations? In fact, doesn't the Bible indicate that on occasion that did happen with seemingly no ill results? True or false? Abraham married his half-sister. True. Anything wrong so far as you can tell from a straightforward reading of the text with anything with their children? Isaac? No. True or false? Lot had what you and I would call an incestuous relationship with his two daughters, which gave rise to offspring in both instances. True. Anything wrong with those children, again, so far as you can tell from a straightforward reading of the text? No. Question: when did God himself, by divine edict from the throne of heaven, reach in and stop incestuous relationships, before or after the events of Genesis 6 through 8? Afterwards. Leviticus chapter 18 to be explicit. God said from this point forward, no more such intermarriages. Why? Why did God stop that when previously it was perfectly acceptable? I think the answer to that question is also the answer to the question we asked earlier. What changed this globe? I am convinced from a study of the scientific and the biblical evidence, what changed this globe happened to be the events of Genesis 6 through 8. In Genesis 6:5, God looked down upon this earth, and what did he see here? It says every thought of the heart of the imagination of man was to do only evil continually. Let's face it, we had become a sorry and sinful lot of folks. And God, he wasn't going to have it anymore. We were a stench in his nostrils. Or better yet, the sin we committed was a stench. And so God said, I'm going to destroy the earth and everything that lives on it. I'm going to send a flood of waters and wash it clean, and we'll just start this thing over. And he would have done exactly that had it not been for that little tiny verse, Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Folks, let's face it. You and I wouldn't be here this afternoon discussing this if it weren't for that one verse and the verse that follows it. In Genesis 6:9, God said this. He said of Noah three things. He said Noah was a man who was upright. Some translations say righteous. The meaning of the text is he was honest. Apparently in that day and age, honesty was a real scarce commodity. Secondly, it says he was a man who was perfect in his generations. Wow. A man who never sinned, he was perfect? Oh no, friends, that's not the point. The meaning of the original language is he was complete. He was doing the best job he could with the tools available to him, and he must have been doing a very good job of it, because that last description is reserved for only a small handful of people in all of Holy Writ. Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, being one of them, James 2:23. It says that Noah was a man who walked with God. And God said, Noah, I'll save you and your family. But Noah, I'm going to send a flood of waters upon this earth to destroy every land-living, air-breathing creature, humans included. I'll save you, but it's going to cost you. Because, Noah, I have a job for you. I want you to build an ark. Folks, this word ark in the Old Testament is only used in two contexts in the whole of the Old Testament. It's used once in the context of Genesis 6 through 8, and the second, last time, in Exodus 2, the ark into which baby Moses was placed amidst the bulrushes of the Nile River to escape the cruel decree of a Pharaoh. This word ark derives from an old Egyptian term meaning a barge, something that floats in water. This is not the same word as the Ark of the Covenant of God. That's a totally different word. God said, Noah, I'm going to get you to build an ark, and I want you to build it out of gopher wood with 3 decks, 1 window, 1 door, and I want it pitched within and without with pitch. Pitch is a rosin that oozes from certain trees. It's like sap. It could be used to coat the boards inside and out to prevent water from creeping through the cracks during the year-long trip that was going to be made in that vessel. And God said it's supposed to have cabins, cubicles, cells on every deck. Oh, and by the way, Noah, one last point. Genesis 6:3. My spirit shall abide with mankind only 120 more years. The task God gave Noah, he had a probationary period in which to carry out. 120 years. Now, apparently he didn't use all that. How do we know? Because it says he was 500 years old when God spoke to him, but only 600 when he went into the ark. So of the 120, apparently he used 100 years or less. We're not told exactly how many. The story that we're discussing this afternoon from the text of Genesis 6-8 has been the brunt of more vicious attacks, more unseemly jokes than perhaps any other section of Scripture throughout all of history. Skepticism, atheism, agnosticism, infidelity of every stripe has ridiculed and mocked this story almost unmercifully. Some short time ago, in fact, roughly a month ago, I got an email from an atheist who had seen some of our material on a website that we maintain at Apologetics Press, and he was absolutely furious. He wrote me an email that would just burn asbestos. And he said, I don't get it. He said, you stupid, pitiful people who call yourselves Christians, he said, why don't you folks finally wake up, smell the coffee, come to the party, and realize this story is nothing but a Mother Goose fairy tale, and not a very good one at that. He said it's fraught with insuperable difficulties. He said, number one, he said these were ignorant and unlearned people. They didn't have the technology or the knowledge or the capability to use the technology if they'd had it to build a boat of this size. And he said, secondly, these people could not have built a boat big enough to carry two of every species of animal on the face of the earth. He said, that's impossible on the face of it. He said, thirdly, how do you think they got the animals to the boat? What did Noah do? Did he leave Mrs. Noah there tacking away ever so carefully while he made a little trip down to Australia to pick him up a couple of koala bears, one under each arm, to cart them back? And then he dropped them off and he went down to South America and picked him up a couple of llamas, one under each arm, and carted them back? And then he said, even if you could get all the animals on the earth into the boat, two of every species, he said, how in the world are 8 people going to take care of all those animals for 371 days in that boat by themselves? He said, anybody with one eye, the ability to see through a ladder, could understand that this is absolutely ludicrous. Give it up, he said. Folks, let me point out something to you this afternoon, especially to our youngsters. It's very easy to sit behind a computer screen or at a typewriter or behind a microphone into a tape recorder and say or write or type anything you want. It is entirely another thing to have what you have said or written examined in the light of the actual evidence. Those people who criticize the Bible the loudest, mark it down this afternoon, generally speaking, are those who have read it the least. Here was the perfect example. It was a piece of cake to answer this kind of charge against the Bible. Friends, there are things that charges come, we have to really dig to work on them. This wasn't one of them. Examine this with me for just a moment. Number one, the atheist says these people were ignorant, they were unlearned, they didn't have the technology, the knowledge. You and I, our children and grandchildren throughout the years, have been exposed to pictures like I showed you earlier that make our forebears look as if they were some kind of hair-covered, square-jawed, long-armed, root-browed creature that fell out of a tree in Africa and ever so slowly but ever so surely made their way up through a Stone Age, an Iron Age, a Bronze Age, and so on. I want us to know, I want our children and grandchildren to know these kinds of people never existed. This is a figment of an evolutionist, overactive imagination. There were never people like this on this earth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the atheist has thrown down the gauntlet. He has challenged us to pick it up. He broached the subject. It is only right we be able to respond to it. I will be happy to pick up that gauntlet and to respond. He says, number one, these were ignorant, unlearned people. Who were ignorant? He made it clear in his letter. He said, these people, these early biblical people. No. Folks, that cannot be sustained even for an instant. Look at the facts. These early people from Adam forward were always extremely intellectual, very technologically endowed, and ingenious in their devices. Did you ever notice, if you'd like to know just how smart they really were, on day 6, right after Adam had been created, and had been on the earth for a while, but before Eve had been created, what was going on? It says God looked out of the windows of heaven and Adam was lonely. And God commented, didn't he? It's not good that Adam should be alone. So what did he do? He got all the animals together and he paraded them before Adam. And what did he tell Adam to do? He said, Adam, I'm going to parade these animals before you, and I want you to do two things. Folks, before we go any further, have you picked up on a clue here? There's a conversation being recorded between God and Adam. Conversations require languages. Ask any evolutionist, living or dead, and they will tell you without a single known exception, language is always the sign of the highest possible intelligence. You know why? Because first, the symbols we call letters have to be devised. Then they have to be grouped into a thing we call an alphabet. Then the words have to come from those symbols made up of those letters out of that alphabet. And then once you get the words, they have to be strung together in sentences, which have to fall into paragraphs with syntax and context. Language is extremely difficult to invent, and it is always the sign of the highest possible intelligence. Why do you think the evolutionists have spent so much time trying to teach the monkeys and apes to talk, to sign? Folks, it's an example of extreme intelligence. Adam already had a language. He could understand what God was talking to him about. They were having a conversation. It required a language to have. Who gave Adam that conversational piece? Who invented that language? Who gave it to him, endowed him with it, and what could he do with it? God said, Adam, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to parade these animals here before you, and I want you, number one, to find from them a help meet for you. It's not a help meet. That isn't the word. It's a helper, meet for, suitable for, adequate for you. Wait a minute. What is going on? Didn't God know Adam wasn't going to find a helper suitable for him among the animals in that kingdom? Friends, what do you think the purpose of the whole exercise was? He wanted to get across to Adam something the people of our generation still haven't figured out. We are no animal. There is nothing in the animal kingdom even close to us. You will never find an animal that has the ability or the desire, much less the capability and technology, to invent a pencil and paper, a pen, sit down at a desk that he or one like him has made, and with that pencil and paper, construct a novel, a short story, a poem, a sonnet, like a Browning, a Keats, or a Poe. You'll never find an animal that can sit down, write the music, build a grand piano upon which to play it, and with the talent of a Liberace or Van Cliburn make those 88 keys sing beautifully. You'll never find an animal that can build a building like this, gather together on a solemn occasion we routinely call a funeral, to pay homage to one of their own lying in a casket at the front of the building because of a great commitment to the race that one has exhibited. Folks, we are light years removed from anything in the animal kingdom. Adam got that point full force. Shame, isn't it, that so many of our generation have completely missed it. And second, said God, I want you to do this. Adam, I want you to name those animals. Don't just read it. Think through it. Folks, think what he's asking God to do. He says, Adam, I want you to name those animals. What's the implication? Remember what you called each one of them so that you can pass those names down to be used throughout human history. Question. Suppose God were to reach out to you this afternoon and say, excuse me, God's got a task here for you. I'm going to run in front of you all the animals I've created. You just name them. Remember what you called them. Pass those names down faithfully from generation to generation. Could you do it? I can't speak for you. I'm perfectly content, thank you, to leave that to my father Adam. It was a Herculean task, but one that he carried out with utter aplomb. We're still using the names 6,000 years later. Folks, don't give me this idea. Don't try to peddle to our children that these early people were ignorant and unlearned. They most certainly were not. Did you ever notice in Genesis chapter 4, beginning verse 21 and following, it says that there was one of Adam's descendants, a man by the name of Tubal-Cain. Only 2 or 3 generations removed from Adam he was, and it already makes this statement of him. It says he was a forger of every kind of cutting instrument of brass and of iron. These early peoples had already figured out where the ores were in the earth, pulled them out, smelted them into valuable and useful metals. Do you have any kind of idea of the intellect that requires? Did you ever notice in Genesis chapter 11 These people were constructing, what does it say? A tower that stretched into the heavens. Folks, this was the first skyscraper, and a skyscraper it was. The text says these people were so industrious, so intelligent, it says they were of one mind and one spirit, and nothing they set their minds to do would be forbidden from them. In order to get them to spread around the globe, God had to confound their languages, which is why we call it today the Tower of Babel. Don't think for the moment of languages, folks. Think of the tower. This was a structure like you have never seen before. It was amazing. Do you realize what some of these ignorant and unlearned peoples of the distant past could do? Our ancestors that were supposed to be making themselves up out of the Stone Age, do you realize that some of the wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Sphinx and Pyramids of Egypt, the lighthouse at Pharos, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, for some of those structures, those ignorant and unlearned peoples moved blocks of stone that weighed over 600 tons each, over 400 miles, and dropped them into place at less than half a degree off of Plum. We don't have a clue how they did it. That they did it is evinced by the structures that still stand today, is it not? The ancient Egyptians possessed medical knowledge that was so phenomenal, we today still stand in awe of it. They could mummify a man who died 1,000 years ago. You open him up today, it looks like he died day before yesterday. We don't have a clue how they did it. Their great scholars can't figure it out. That they did it is evinced by the tombs of the pharaohs we have opened, is it not? Friends, this idea that has been peddled, that our ancient ancestors were these hair-covered, square-jawed, long-armed, root-browed creatures that fell out of a tree, couldn't be more false than it is. We have always been a people very industrious, extremely intellectual. Secondly, the atheist says, well, he says, how could they have built a boat big enough to carry two of every species of animal on the face of the earth? That's stupid. Folks, I'll tell you what's stupid. If anything is going to be labeled stupid, it's making an argument against the Bible when the Bible doesn't even make the argument to begin with that you're arguing against. Tell me, anywhere in God's Word did God tell Noah he had to take two of every species of animal? Where does it say that? It doesn't, does it? It says God told Noah to take two of all the unclean, or seven of all the clean of every kind of animal. Well, someone says, what's the difference? Sounds like you're splitting hairs. No, folks. This is a very important, very critical difference. Let me explain to you what's happened here. The biologist's word species is not anywhere like the biblical word kind. What happened was this. Back in the 1700s, there was a Swedish botanist by the name of Carolus von Linnaeus. Linnaeus decided everything needed to be given a name. All the plants, all the animals, everything. So he started what we now know as the binomial nomenclature system of taxonomy, for which most high school and biology students would like to meet him in a dark alley with a tire iron to say thank you. He's the guy that said, well, we've got to make, we need a kingdom, and a phylum, and a class, and an order, and a genus, and a species, and all the way down. And not only that, but to make this thing work, we need to make everything have Latin endings on all the words. The dead language, good choice.
Please resume listening to Dr. Thompson on the other...
With names, genus and species, kind of the first and last name of things, like the genus and species name for the common rat, Rattus rattus. The dog, Canis familiaris. The cow, Bos domesticus. Humans, Homo sapiens. You know what that means? That means he who is the wise one. I've always found that, I must admit, somewhat of an enigma. That those of us who write and publish books that look like this would have the audacity to call ourselves the wise ones. Nevertheless, In order to make this whole nomenclature system work, you know what we had to have? Definitions to go with the words. If I ask you to put something in a class, if you don't know what a class is, you can't put it in there, can you? So we invented classes and phyla and genera and all this stuff, and we gave them all definitions. Okay. Suppose you were in my biology class, and I walked in bright and early one Monday morning, and I spoke those words that strike fear into the hearts of every American student. Shut your books and get out your pencil and paper. It's pop quiz time. And to make matters infinitely worse, I announce to you this pop quiz only has one question. Oh yes, it's one of those dreaded 0 or 100 pop quizzes. You pass, you fail, nothing in between. And here is the singular question. Define for me a biological species. You want that 100? You want the A? You better jolly well give me something that goes real close to this. A biological species is a group of animals, plants, or humans that always remain in nature geographically and reproductively isolated from all others. Great definition. You get the 100. It's a great definition. It doesn't work, but it's a great definition. True or false? Coyotes, wolves, dogs, jackals, and dingoes are all separate, distinct, individual biological species. True. Check any science book. Ask any veterinarian. True or false? Coyotes, wolves, dogs, jackals, and dingoes can all interbreed. True. Ask any veterinarian. Folks, they can't. That's impossible. They shouldn't be able to interbreed. They're different species. They do interbreed. You folks here in Tennessee, when you breed your donkey to your horse, what do you invariably get out? A mule. And you breed the mule with absolutely nothing. Why? Because in nature, you've hit the end of the kind. Folks, the horse, the mule, the donkey, they're all in the same kind. The coyote, the wolf, the dog, the jackal, the dingo, they're all in the same kind. Noah didn't have to take on board the boat 2 of every species. He didn't have to take a wolf, a coyote, a jackal, a dingo. No, he didn't have to take 2 Weimaraners, 2 Great Danes, 2 collies, 2 Chihuahuas. That is not what God was telling him. He said take 2 of every kind. I don't have the time today, but if I did, I could show you. I could use the figures of the world-renowned eminent evolutionary taxonomist, Dr. Ernst Mayr of Harvard. I could take 2 of every species, not kind, species of animal on the face of the earth today that lives on land. Remember? That's all Noah had to take on board the boat, with those that lived on land. God specifically told him, you have to take into the boat everything in which there is the breath of the spirit of life. Folks, that's the Hebrew meaning every land-living, air-breathing creature has to go into that boat. I could use the evolutionist figures, take 2 of every species of animal on the face of the earth today, put them in the boat, and not even fill half the boat. Don't give me this junk about the boat isn't big enough. Question, who created the animals? God did. Who gave Noah the dimensions for the ark? God did. Question, you think God's smart enough to get the 2 figures together? How many animals he himself had created and how big a boat he might need to carry them somewhere? I do. And by the way, as long as we're on this subject, something that, of course, the atheist in his letter to me did not ever broach, how big was the ark? Friends, it's not like you're left to guess. The text tells you how large it was. It was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. Which doesn't help you a bit if you don't know what a cubit was, does it? But fortunately, today we know what a cubit was. The word cubit in the Hebrew language derives from the Hebrew word meaning forearm, because that's how they measured it. Tip of the middle finger to the end of the elbow. Roughly 1.5 feet. And by the way, that's the most conservative cubit ever known. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, they had royal cubits. 21 to 24 inches they went. I'm going to use the most conservative cubit ever documented, 18 inches. Do you realize how big that makes that boat? Friends, you're talking about a boat that's 300 times a foot and a half. You're talking about a boat that is 450 feet long, over a football field and a half in length, over half a football field wide, over 3.5 stories tall. It would have, by conservative estimates, contained 100,000 square feet of deck space, almost 1.5 million cubic feet of storage space, 1,396,000 in case you're counting exactly. And if you'd like me to wipe those questioning expressions off your face because you don't understand what I'm talking about by giving you something that you can, let me put it to you this way. If you and I were to stop this lecture right now, go down to the nearest railroad crossing here in McMinnville, and we stood there and watched a giant engine pull behind it across that track in front of us 52 railroad boxcars. You know how many of those 52 railroad boxcars would fit into that ark? All 52 of them. And 9 more trains just like that one. It had the carrying capacity of 520 American railroad boxcars. Folks, this was no small boat built on a Saturday afternoon. This thing took almost a century to construct. Up until the year 1858, may I remind you that was just 141 years ago, when Mr. I.K. Brunel built his boat, the Great Eastern, there had never in all of human history been a boat built bigger than the Ark. That was just 141 short years ago. This thing was absolutely colossal in size. Was it big enough? Oh, indeed it was. But the atheist says, well, how'd they get the animals to the boat? What they do, go down to Australia for a couple of koalas and down to South America for a couple of llamas? Question, how does the atheist know before the flood there were koala bears in Australia? Llamas in South America. How does he know before the flood there was even an Australia or South America? He doesn't know that. He just dreamed that up to strip it down as if he's making a straw man to play with. Folks, if he had read the Bible, he wouldn't be making such ridiculous arguments to begin with. This is what I meant earlier when I said the people who criticize the Bible the loudest generally are those who've read it the least. And here again is the perfect example. Genesis 6:19 and 20. Did you ever read it? It says very plainly, God caused the animals to come unto Noah. Folks, Noah didn't have to go to Australia for koalas or South America for llamas. He was busy building the boat, doing exactly what God told him to do. God got the animals to Noah. I don't know how you look at it, but the way I look at it, if he could bring them to Adam to be named, couldn't he just as easily bring them to Noah to be saved? And of course, you know how the modernists and the liberalists look at it, where they go, that's a miracle. No kidding. Friends, we're not talking one single miracle here. This flood was a miracle from beginning to end. And if the atheist, the skeptic, the liberal, the modernist, the neo-orthodoxist thinks that he's going to stampede us away from the miracles of the Bible, he's got another thing coming. Those miracles are not warts. They're not growths that are growing there on the side of the text that you can just come by with a penknife of Jehoiakim and chop off, hoping to leave the remainder intact. Folks, those miracles are integral parts of what God was trying to get across. I think it's safe for me to say many of you sitting in this auditorium today, and no doubt many of those listening to us on the radio today, believe in one of the greatest miracles of all times, historically documented miracles, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. If I robbed you today of that miracle, what would you have? Absolutely, isn't that nothing? Isn't that what Paul said? 1 Corinthians 15, your faith would be in vain. You will be still in your sins. But folks, that miracle did happen. We're not going to be stampeded away from the miracles of the Bible. And by the way, as long as we're on this topic, let me just mention one other thing. Maybe it wasn't a miracle. Didn't God tell Noah that he had 120 years in which to build a boat? Is it possible that God, through no miraculous events, but only using divine providence and natural laws, moved those animals from wherever it was they were on the earth, generation by generation by generation over the 100 years, to where when he finally needed them, Noah found them nearby within the confines of the ark? Is that possible? Yes, it is. Lastly, the atheist says, well, how could 8 people take care of all those animals in that boat by themselves? Where in the world did he come up with the idea they were in the boat by themselves? Friends, listen to me very carefully. These first 11 chapters of Genesis are literally packed with these precious little pearls of knowledge. They're strewn through this thing like great treasures, lying there waiting to be discovered. And we read through them so hurriedly, we miss them. Let me show you one of those pearls today. Genesis chapter 7, verse 1. A tiny little passage that packs a tremendous wallop. If you're reading it out of a King James Version like the Pew Bible that you've got there in front of you, or the American Standard of 1901, both of those versions have the actual Hebrew verb translated into the English correctly. There are several other versions that do as well, but not all. The translation of the verb is critical. Folks, it's God talking to Noah. And listen to what he says. He says, Noah, come thou into the ark. It does not say, Noah, you and yours, go over yonder and get in that boat. It says, Noah, come into the ark. It's a personal invitation from the Lord God, creator of the universe, to join him in that ship for a year-long trip. Folks, they weren't by themselves. How do I know that? Because exactly one chapter later, in chapter 8, verse 1, you're going to find this tiny little commentary. Listen to it very carefully. It says, and God remembered Noah. That word remembered in the Hebrew is this word. It's the Hebrew word zakar. And the only reason I point that out to you today is this. Every time in the Old Testament you find that word used, it is indicative of God personally moving closer to something that he prizes greatly to throw his arms of protection around. God remembered, protected, did not abandon Noah. What does that mean? What does it mean God remembered Noah? Friends, here is one of those little pearls. Watch this. You want to see the power of your God at work? You want to teach your young people the kind of God, the power of this God? Watching and send chills down your spine as you sit in awe of his majesty. Genesis chapter 7, verses 19 and 20. It says, when the flood waters hit this earth, every high mountain over the whole earth was covered. Listen to it. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail. Why did the waters have to go 15 cubits, 22 and a half feet above the highest mountains of that day? Why? Tell me something. What's the draft of a boat? Well, the draft's how far it sinks in the water when you fully load it. What's the formula for the draft of a boat? What kind of boat are you building? Are you constructing a cigarette speedboat for a Saturday afternoon race on the lake? Or are you constructing a giant Shell oil company tanker to carry crude oil from Iran to America? Folks, the different structures are for different purposes. Different boats for different purposes have different formulas for their drafts. What is the formula for the draft of a giant boat like the Ark that wasn't built for speed, but instead for seaworthiness? Let's face it. It wasn't built for speed. It had nowhere to go. But it was built for seaworthiness, wasn't it? To withstand bashing waves and whipping winds for a year. What's the formula for the draft of such a boat? Ask any sailor, any seafaring man. They can tell you it's common knowledge. The draft of a boat is always half the height. You fill a boat that's 100 feet tall full, it's going to sink 50 feet. How tall was the Ark? Well, it was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. What's half of 30? 15. It was going to sink 15 cubits in the water. It was going to be in danger of its bottom bashing into the tops of mountains, tips. No, it was not. Because although it sank half the height, 15 cubits, the waters prevailed upwards above the highest mountains of that day. How tall? 15 cubits. God remembered Noah. Friends, he didn't leave the smallest iota to chance. His power of divine providence governed that thing from beginning to end. Question. Where did the waters for the flood come from? Two sources, isn't there? Doesn't it say very plainly the fountains of the great deep broke open? You're talking about volcanic underwater activity that split the ocean bottoms, and folks, fresh water began to come up and the oceans began to rise. But that isn't all. Doesn't it go on to say that it also, God opened the windows of heaven? That it rained on this earth for how long? 40 days and 40 nights. Don't just read it. Think through it. If you left this auditorium today and it was pouring down cats and dogs, I mean raining hard, and you came back tomorrow morning for Bible class and it was raining real hard, just as hard, and it never stopped, and you came back Sunday night, it was still raining, and you went to work Monday, it was still raining, and Tuesday it was still raining, and Wednesday it was still raining, I'm not talking about 4 or 5 days. I'm not talking about a week and a half. I'm talking about a month and 10 days of non-ending, never-stopping, unceasing rain. And I am not talking about an afternoon shower in the middle of March. I'm talking about the wrath of an angry God upon a sin-sick, doomed to die world. He opened the windows of heaven and water fell out on this earth for a month and 10 days and never stopped. Do you have any earthly idea how much water that would require? What is the source of that water? I suggest to you today it was the ultimate and imminent collapse of that canopy upon this earth. And friends, when it collapsed, this globe was inundated. Question. What happened to the dinosaurs? You thought I'd forgotten, didn't you? No. Friends, I'm trying to show you the golden thread. Watch it. Watch the logic fall together. Watch the pieces. True or false? The dinosaurs were a part of the original 6-day creation of God. True. Exodus 20:11 so states. True or false? After that 6-day creation, nothing was ever created thereafter. True. Genesis 2:1 so states. And the creation was finished. True or false? The dinosaurs were alive after the flood. True. The book of Job is a post-flood book. It even mentions the flood in the book. Were the dinosaurs alive after the flood? They had to be. God was using one of them with Job to get a point across. Folks, if they were alive after the flood, didn't they by definition have to be alive before the flood? Yes. What happened to the dinosaurs? What happened to all the animals on the face of the earth when the flood came, except those that were within the safety of the ark? What happened to them? They died in the great global flood. You can go today and stand on the borders of Colorado and Utah in this country inside Dinosaur National Park, you can cast your eyes up to a building, a mountain that is bigger than this building by far. And you can see extruding from it multiplied millions of dinosaur bones. Something took those animals, backed them into a corner, and slaughtered them en masse, fossilizing them instantaneously. Friends, that isn't the exception, that's the rule. Did you ever pick up on the clue I gave you at the 1 o'clock lecture? I said, where do we have dinosaur fossils? And I said, we have them on all 7 continents. Arctic to Antarctic and every continent in between. What do you know on this planet that could cause global fossilization of this magnitude? A worldwide flood could do it. I suggest to you a worldwide flood did do it. Friends, the question isn't what happened to the dinosaurs. The question is, what happened to the dinosaurs when they came off the ark? Somebody says, whoa, wait a minute. Dinosaurs on the ark? Didn't you tell us earlier that some of these creatures were 110 tons, 3.5 stories? Huh. How could you have room for an animal like that on a boat like that? Folks, listen to me. Sometimes what the Bible doesn't say is equally as important as what it does. Here may well be one of those places. Tell me, where in the Bible does it say that God told Noah to take on board the boat adult animals? Doesn't say that, does it? Friends, I don't know what Noah did because the Bible doesn't say. We've always prided ourselves, and rightly so, the proper kind of pride, of being people who speak where the Bible speaks and remaining silent where the Bible is silent. We don't know the answer to this. But let me ask you this question. What if God had allowed Noah a little leeway? What if Noah had been able to take on board that boat immature animals? What would that accomplish? 3 things, wouldn't it? Number 1, they wouldn't be as big. They wouldn't occupy as much space. Number 2, they wouldn't eat as much. You wouldn't have to take on board as much food. Number 3, think about the potential reproductive problems that could be avoided if you could take immature animals. Can you imagine in your mind's eye Mr. and Mrs. Noah carrying on board that boat for 371 days, Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit? You could open the door and nothing but rabbits tumble out. Folks, I'm being facetious, but my point is, maybe God allowed Noah some leeway with which we're not familiar because, quite honestly, we had no need to know. What happened to those animals when they came off the ark? Why don't we have dinosaurs apparently today? That's the part none of us can answer. I'll give you a suggestion, but that's all it is, just a suggestion. You can take it or leave it for what it's worth. Do you remember what happened in March of 1997 here in America? June of 93, something similar happened. In June of 93, the mighty Mississippi River overran her banks. In March of 97, the mighty Ohio did the same. We, you and I, sat glued to our television sets night by night, watching friends, neighbors, loved ones, relatives, fellow citizens, holding lines stringing from helicopters for dear life. We saw livestock, pets, dogs, cats, food animals, chickens, cattle, on the tops of roofs of houses and barns trying to escape the ever-rising water, and we blinked and looked back, and they were gone, washed away in an instant. We saw old homesteads that had held hallowed memories of sacred times, of generations long gone, washed away by a raging river that did not care. Tell me something. When those thousands and thousands of people who'd been evacuated finally were able to return to where their homes used to be, was everything just like when they had left it? No. Would it ever be again? No. That river cut gouges into the earth. It lifted up foundations of buildings and turned them topsy-turvy. It destroyed livestock and humans. Folks, those are two little tiny rivers running through 4 or 5 states on one little continent. Think about the destruction that flood would do to this ball we call the earth when it was a global flood that lasted 371 days. The volcanoes ripping the oceans apart. The water falling out of the heavens for a month and 10 days. You go and stand on the brink of the Grand Canyon in Arizona, as some of us have done, and you see those multicolored hued layers. You stand and look at the Waimea Canyon on the island of Kauai, what they call the Grand Canyon of the Pacific in the Hawaiian chain. You stand in Palo Duro Canyon in West Texas, or Big Bend National Park in that same state. I think you're getting just an inkling of some of the damage that flood did to this home we call today the earth. Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's just possible those dinosaurs stepped out of that ark, paused for a moment, took a look around them, and saw an earth the likes of which they had never seen before? They left a lush tropical paradise worldwide, mantle of spring-like loveliness that prevailed over the whole globe, canopy in place, pristine conditions. They returned to an earth that was denuded of its vegetation, stripped bare by raging floodwaters, mountains leveled, seas brought up. Do you think it's possible they came back to an environment that was so completely and utterly hostile to them that they tried, gave it their best shot? They just couldn't hack it. Is that possible? Yes, it is. You know, something odd that seems to me, I've never had anybody in all the years I've been lecturing ask me, what happened to the saber-toothed tiger? Why is it extinct? I've never had anybody ask me, excuse me, what happened to the passenger pigeon? Why is it extinct? But everybody and their dog wants to know what happened to the dinosaurs. Friends, we're not going to know any more about what happened to them than we are the passenger pigeon, the saber-toothed tiger, or any of the other thousands of animals that are extinct. We just don't know. But I think the scenario that I've set for you this afternoon certainly provides some interesting and intriguing examples of what could have happened from the biblical and scientific information we have at our access. But that brings to mind another question, doesn't it? If all of us came to this planet ultimately through Noah and the people of the flood, and then tracing that back to Adam and Eve, how is it that some of us today have black skin? Some of us have white, some red, some yellow, some brown, and almost everything in between. What caused that? These human races of people, as we call them. Now, folks, let me make it clear to you today. The Bible only recognizes one race, the human race. It doesn't matter what color you are. We're all created in the image and likeness of God. But it is an interesting and intriguing question to ask, why are we then different colors? Well, what causes human skin coloration, or for that matter, pigmentation in animals? It's a pigment called melanin. If you have a whole lot of melanin in your system, you're very dark-skinned. If you have very little melanin in your skin, you're very light-skinned. What are you if you have absolutely no melanin? That's the albino condition, isn't it? That is caused by a genetic mutation. Have you ever seen an albino human or animal? If you have, you've probably been struck by the fact that their eyes and their skin are pink. No, they're not. Their eyes and skin are crystal clear. They have no melanin. You have enough melanin to mask over the oxygenated blood running beneath your skin and the arteries. They have no melanin. The pink aura or hue that you're seeing is the oxygenated blood running immediately underneath the skin. You're literally seeing clear through them. What causes the melanin to be produced? What controls it? Two pairs of genes. In genetics, we, for ease of identifying them, refer to them as capital A, little a, and capital B, little b. And if you remember your high school biology, you may recall the capital letters are representative of what we call dominant genes. They can produce the melanin very easily. The little letters are representative of what we call recessive genes. They can produce the melanin, but not quite so easily. So what you say this afternoon, we just do this by a simple process of elimination. Suppose Adam and Eve had been this. All capital letters. That's what we today call the homozygous dominant condition. That's the darkest human skin coloration possible. If Adam were that and Eve were that, barring a few mutations along the way, what would you have for the most part here on the earth today? Yeah, a whole world full of black folks. Question is, do you? Answer is, not even close. That's the breakdown that you're seeing on the screen anthropologically of the world's races today by skin colors. 55% of the world is Caucasoid, the lighter-skinned peoples. 37% of the Mongoloids, reds, yellows, browns, and 8% of the Negroids, or blacker, darker-skinned peoples. Simple fact of the matter. Adam and Eve weren't black. And someone's going to say, excuse me, but aren't you aware of the fact that we're in a politically correct environment today? Aren't you afraid you're going to offend somebody if you go around the country just slashing a big X through that on the board, saying, well, Adam and Eve weren't black? Oh, folks, don't worry about it. Before the day's over, I plan to offend everybody. In fact, let me just be about it. Suppose Adam and Eve were this. Homozygous recessive. All little letters. That's the lightest human skin coloration possible. If Adam and Eve were that, barring a few mutations along the way, what would you have today on the face of the earth? Whole world full of white folks. Do you? Not even close. Almost half the world, folks, is not white. Adam and Eve weren't white folks either. In spite of what you see every summer on the front of your VBS literature. Suppose Adam and Eve had been this. Capital A, little b, or the reverse. Little a, capital B. If Adam and Eve had both been this, or if they had both been this, what would you get? One thing only. Straight down the middle, brown. Nothing darker, nothing lighter, straight down the middle, brown, about the color of a dark-skinned Spaniard, dark-skinned Italian, Mexican-American, that's it. Nothing but. Is that what you got? No. Someone says, you better hurry, mister, you're running out of options real fast. That's true, I am. But I have one left. What if Adam and Eve had been heterozygous? What if they had been capital A, capital B, little b? What if the fellow at the top left were Adam, the lady at the top right were Eve? What could you get, and how long would it take you to get it? Folks, again, all you got to do is ask the high school students in here. They've seen it. They know how to do it. This is a favorite among the wee biology teachers. You just have to put all of this information into a Punnett square. If you know the genetic makeup of the parent stock, Using the Punnett square, you can determine the genetic makeup of the offspring, in theory. If Adam and Eve had been heterozygous, here's what you could get. In one generation, from one parent pair, you'd get one at the top left that's homozygous dominant, darkest skin coloration possible. One at the bottom right that's homozygous recessive, lightest skin coloration possible. 6 of that middle-of-the-road brown color, which I just spoke, going diagonally from bottom left up to top right, 1 plus 4 in the middle plus 1, 4 darker than that, 2 at the left, 2 at the top, 4 lighter than that, 2 at the bottom, 2 at the right. Out of one single parent pair in one single generation, you could get 16 children, 1 very dark, 1 very light, 6 in the middle, 4 on either side, and 1 very tired mother. Now, just for the sake of argument, suppose, watch the golden thread, suppose the fella at the top left is Cain, but the sister he married is the lady at the bottom right. What happens when the black marries the white and they produce offspring? What's the color we call those offspring? It's called mulatto, isn't it? And folks, what happens then if the mulatto marries back to the black or back to the white? You get a darkening of the light or lightening of the dark, depending on which direction you go. Do you realize that conservative scholars suggest by the time the flood hit this planet, there were already 2 billion people on the face of the earth? 2 billion. Folks, think about it. These people lived an average of 912 years. They had long lifespans, long reproductive spans. Did you ever pick up on a little clue in the text regarding Moses and God? Do you remember the time when Moses came to take the people across the River Jordan into the Promised Land, and God said, "No, Moses, everybody's going, but you're not going in." Moses said, "I want to go. I worked for 40 years to get." "No," said God, "you're not going in. You struck the rock instead of speaking to it. You didn't uphold me before the people of Israel, and you're not going in. But I will take you to the top of Mount Nebo, and I'll let you cast a wishful eye over into the land." So God did just that. And do you remember at the end of that text it says, "And God buried Moses at the base of Mount Nebo where no man knows." Listen to it. "And he was 120 years old, and his natural force was not yet abated." Folks, that's the Hebrew terminology, meaning at 120 years of age, he was still quite capable of siring a child. These people had long reproductive spans, long lifespans. 2 billion people on the face of the earth by the time the flood came, conservatively speaking. Somebody says, "That's not going to help you any." How you lost all the people but 8? How are you going to get the genetic variation you see around you today with just 8 people? What do you mean, just 8? I got that with just 2. If you give me 8, I'm in hog heaven. Oh, and besides, folks, don't forget, the golden thread hasn't stopped yet. True or false? Genetics is controlled by environment. False. Genetics controls genetics. True or false? Genetics can be affected by environment. True. What's a suntan? Oh, you go out and you lay on the beach, you get a lot of sun, your skin turns darker. Why? What's the skin doing? What's the body responding to? Isn't the melanin a protection factor? It's put in our bodies so that as we get hit by the sun's rays, it can absorb the sun's rays and it doesn't damage the DNA. It does it very well. Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. True or false? The people were separated. They were dispersed by skin colors. False. They were dispersed by what? Languages, exactly. Folks, imagine at that dispersion, you had some people that were white, some that were black, but they all spoke Swahili. So they migrated down to the African continent near the equator where Swahili is today still spoken. Who has the better chance of survival long term in that sun-rich environment? Black or white-skinned people? The blacks. They're going to absorb the sun easier, be more protected. Who's going to die off first of melanomas, skin cancers, and related maladies? The whites. Leaving a preponderance in that area of the world of people who are black. Reverse it. Suppose at the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, you have a group of people, some black, some white, but they all speak Swedish. They migrate to the Scandinavian countries where Swedish today is still spoken. In that sun-poor environment, who has the better chance of survival? Blacks or whites? The whites. The blacks can't absorb enough sun to make vitamin D. They die off of rickets, related diseases, leaving a preponderance in that area of the world of people who have white skin. Name the exception. People who have very dark skin but who live where there's very little sun. Yeah, the Eskimos. You're wrong. It's a trick question. Folks, the Eskimos migrated to the Arctic regions with their skin color already intact. They then continued to marry only within their gene pool. If you continue to marry only within your gene pool, barring a few mutations again along the way, what are you going to always get out? Exactly what you've got. That's what the DNA does, and does best is reproduce itself. That's what it was designed by God to do. But someone may wonder, how can they live with dark skin where there's no sun? How can they get vitamin D? From the fish oil that they eat. They get from their diet what others had to get from the environment. And friends, isn't that an amazing testimony to the redundant systems built within this body? Amazing design. You lose one lung, you've got another. You lose a kidney, you've got another. Amazing design built into this. We can adapt. We can get it from the environment. We can get it from diet. All sorts of ways that we succeed and adapt, thanks to that initial design. But one last question comes to mind. When's all this going on? Or if I could put it a different way, how old is the earth? You may have had people tell you, I've had people tell me, and again, I don't challenge their motives. They say, well, you can believe the earth is as old or as young as you want because the Bible doesn't say anything about the age of the earth. Friends, that's not true now and has never been true and will never be true. The Bible will dictate to you the age of the earth, but you've got to put the... But one last question comes to mind. When's all this going on? Or if I could put it a different way, how old is the earth? You may have had people tell you, I've had people tell me, and again, I don't challenge their motives. They say, well, you can believe the earth is as old or as young as you want because the Bible doesn't say anything about the age of the earth. Friends, that's not true now and has never been true and will never be true. The Bible will dictate to you the age of the earth, but you've got to put the pieces of the puzzle together to catch it. I like to call it a mosaic. When all the pieces fit, the pattern is perfect. Well, let me give you these 4 pieces, and you'll have the answer to the question of how old the earth is from God's Word. First piece of the puzzle. Mark chapter 10, verse 6. And if you'd like a corollary passage to go with it, you can write down Matthew 19, verse 4. Now, generally, when you speak to people that know something about the Bible, they know what's going on in Matthew 19. Mark 10 is the same passage, just a different author, Mark. This is where Jesus is being attacked verbally by the Pharisees regarding his stance on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And do you remember how he responded to that on that occasion? He said, He said this, "Have you not read," speaking to the Pharisees, "that he," speaking of God, "made them male and female," speaking of Adam and Eve, listen to him, "from the beginning of the creation." Folks, that little word "beginning" in the Greek is the word arche. It's the same word from which you take your English word archaeology, the study of initial beginnings. The beginnings of what initially? The beginnings of the creation. The Greek word he used there is kitaseos. It means literally the whole of the creation. What'd you say, Lord? He said somebody's been here, man and woman. How long? Since the very beginning of the creation. Wow. That's an important piece of the puzzle. Here's the second piece. Paul, writing in Romans 1:20 and 21, said this, "The invisible things of God," listen to him, "since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made, even his everlasting power and divinity, that they may be without excuse." What did you say, Paul? The invisible things of God, how long, Paul? Since the creation of the world. Are what, Paul? Clearly seen. How, Paul? Being perceived. Folks, that word perceived is in the Greek this word. It's the word noeo. And again, the reason I point that out is to tell you, every time in the New Testament you find that word used, it's always used of human rational intelligence. Knowing that, listen to Paul again. The invisible things of God, how long, Paul? Since the creation of the world are what, Paul? Clearly seen, how, Paul? Being perceived by humans with rational intelligence. You mean to tell me, Paul, somebody's been on this earth since the beginning of the creation with rational human intelligence? That's right. Who was it? That's the third piece of the puzzle. It's got two parts. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45, the great resurrection chapter, as we so often call it. What did Paul say there? He said, Adam was the first man. 1 Timothy 2:13. Adam was created first, then Eve. Called her by name, didn't he? Not exactly a big shock to us. Friends, this is exactly what Moses had said thousands of years earlier. Now, with those three pieces of the puzzle at your disposal, watch the last piece fall into place. Fill in the blank for me, just in round figures. How many years has it been from us back to Jesus? Just in round figures from secular history. Yeah, about 2,000. I don't know anybody in the secular, atheistic community that would argue that point with you. Folks, even Madeleine Murray O'Hair, when she was around, she wouldn't argue that point with you. World's most famous atheist, probably. And she would not argue that point. It's a little hard to argue with the fact there was a man named Jesus who really lived. All time dates from his birth. Doesn't matter who you think he is for this argument. The point is he existed. How many years from Jesus to Abraham? Again, just in round figures. About 2,000, 2 millennia. And again, that figure has been documented over and over and over by archaeology and any number of the other sciences. Folks, I don't know anybody in the secular historical community that would argue that point. Us to Jesus, 2,000. Jesus to Abraham, 2,000. Those are historically provable. Last piece of the last part of the puzzle. Suppose I could take the marker, turn around very gently, and just stroll back to the board and drop a figure in that blank for you. From Abraham to Adam. What would I then have for you? And friends, watch this. This is where the other three pieces of the puzzle becomes so important. I know, because the Lord said so, man and woman have been here from the beginning of the creation. I know who they were. Paul said somebody had been here from the creation of the world with rational human intelligence observing the things God made, and he named them. Adam, first man; Eve, first woman. If I could get you back to Adam, I would have you within 6 days of the age of the earth. For in 6 days Jehovah hath made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and all that in it is. The question is, can I do it? And the answer, of course, is no. Not from secular history. And you should be mighty glad. If I could turn around with this marker, stroll to that blank, and drop a figure in it from secular history, to what would I have to have access? The same exact things I had to get you those other two figures, the historical documents. I don't have huge portions of those secular historical documents because they were destroyed in the global flood of Noah. If I had the documents, folks, your whole day here would have been worthless. Everything I've said to you would have been a lie. We don't have the documents. Your day here wasn't worthless. It wasn't a lie. Well, someone says, you, sir, are a rascal. You're just going to put us a big old question mark in there and leave us with a big blank? Oh, no, no, no. I don't have to do that. Friends, I can give you what goes in the blank. I just can't give it to you from secular history. I'll give it to you from a better source. God's Word. Do you remember in the Old and New Testaments those passages like Genesis 5, Genesis 11, Luke 3? We call them the genealogies. And oh, when we're children, we love to read them. They go, so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. It's like I had a little boy come up to me recently and ask me, he said, hey, mister, how come God put that stuff in there? Did he need filler material? Folks, they're not there for filler material. The genealogies were given for one specific purpose, so that the Jews would have the access to the genealogy of Christ that they would need to recognize the coming Messiah. House of Jesse, house of David, and so on and so on. They had it, and they still missed it. But did you ever notice that in certain of those Old Testament genealogies, like some in Genesis 5, the age of the father at the time the son was born is given? Then that isn't just genealogy. That's chronology tucked within genealogy. Watch this. Luke chapter 3. Luke gives a genealogy from Adam to Christ. How many generations does Dr. Luke cover between Abraham and Jesus? You can check me on it when you get home if you want to count them. Here's the number. 55. 55 generations between Jesus and Abraham. How many years in secular history does that cover? 2,000. How many generations does Luke cover between Abraham and Adam? The number? Only 20. But ladies and gentlemen, it's in those 20 in the Old Testament book of Genesis chapter 5 where the age of the father at the time the son was born is given. Using that information, you can calculate in rough figures the number that goes in that blank. That number happens to be right at 2,000. And someone's going to go, that can't be right. Something's wrong. You can't have 2,000 years from Jesus to Abraham with 55 generations and 2,000 years from Abraham to Adam with only 20. Something's wrong. Oh, yes. It would absolutely be wrong. Unless, of course, the people between Abraham and Adam lived so much longer. The golden thread continues even into the New Testament. Flawless accuracy. How old is this earth? Folks, I do not know any way in the world respecting the Bible as the inspired, inerrant, authoritative Word of God to get an earth more than about 6,000 years old. I don't know any way to do it. I have seen my entire professional career people try to do it. They have invented theory after theory, the day-age theory, the gap theory, the multiplied gap theory, the multiple gap theory, the day-age, the revelatory day theory, the pictorial day theory, you name it, they've invented it. Theory after theory. And every one of them has failed and failed miserably because God has got this thing so well protected, there's no way around it. Someone's going to say, but the earth looks so old. And every time I hear somebody say that, I immediately respond by saying, compared to what? Friends, this is it. This is the one you're stuck with. There isn't anything to compare to. What do you mean it looks so old? Someone says, well, but these scientists have methods that show the earth to be old. Well, of course they do. Friends, think about it a minute. How in the world could you have evolution if you had a young earth? If you've made up your mind you're not going to believe in God, you're going to believe in evolution. There's nothing anybody can do to say or change your mind. What in the world do you think is going to become one of your top priorities? You're going to have to get an old earth, aren't you? If you can't get an old earth, you can't have evolution. What they don't tell you is there are over 70 different methods from science that you can use to give you a young earth. But you don't ever see those, do you? And folks, let me ask you this question. Why would it surprise us if some scientist out here actually stumbled across something that made the earth seem to be old? Think through it with me just a minute. How old was Adam 2 seconds after God created him? Well, that's easy. The answer's in the question. He's 2 seconds old. Don't you wish your teacher would give you one of those on a quiz? Too easy. She's not going to do it. How old were the plants 2 seconds after God created them? They were 2 seconds old. How old did Adam and Eve and the plants look like they were right after their creation? Oh, that's a separate answer, isn't it? Folks, here's my point. The original creation had 2 ages. It had first a literal age. It was literally 2 seconds or 3 days or 4 days old, whatever. But it also had an apparent age. It appeared to be much older than that. Tell me, what was one of the commands God gave Adam? In fact, the only negative command he gave them. There were 3 positives, 1 negative. What was the negative? Don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil stands in the midst of the garden. If you do, you'll die. Wait a minute. Did you ever think about that? Don't eat the fruit of the tree. The trees were just made on day 3. Adam and Eve were just made 3 days later on day 6, but there's already fruit on the trees? Of course. How are they going to survive? They've got to have something to eat. Friends, the point is when God got this thing finished, it was perfect. The fish were swimming, the birds were flying, the trees were dropping fruit. It was perfect. It was mature. If God had given Adam a McCulloch chainsaw and Adam ripped that thing up and went out in the middle of the garden and sawed down one of those giant oak trees, when that thing fell, would it have had rings in it? Of course it would. It was mature. It was perfect. But if Adam had counted the rings, how many years do you think he would have been on he thought that plant would have been on the earth? Somebody says, wait a minute. Are you trying to tell us that you think God went around lifting up the layers of the earth and tucking in the fossils, and he put the coal and oil there to sort of test us and trick our faith? No. No, absolutely not. Folks, God would never work that way. That is deception. Titus 1:2 says we serve a God who cannot lie. If God put those fossils there, when you stumbled across the fossil, wouldn't you immediately think, that animal, that plant once lived? Here's the fossil. But it didn't. God would have deceived you. God would never work that way. Folks, the doctrine of apparent age, which is what we're discussing here, doesn't mean God went around twisting things, turning things, tricking you. That is not what it means. And besides that, how in the world could anybody accuse God of trickery or deception when he plainly told you what he did? If I walk up to you and say, if you stand there for 20 seconds, I'm going to smack you in the mouth. So you just stand there. And on second number 20, I haul off and flatten you. What are you going to do? You're going to look up and go, boy, that was sneaky. Friends, I told you all along the way what I was doing. God told you all along the way what he was doing. Where do you think I got all this? It's right out of Genesis 1. Don't be surprised if some scientist out there stumbled across something that makes the earth look old. Of course that's going to happen from time to time. Maybe a scientist has legitimately stumbled across something in the earth that gives the appearance of age. If the scientist would read his Bible, if he knew Genesis 1 through 11 as well as he knows radiometric dating, then he could come back to the Bible and go, oh, yeah, I see what's happened here. I've stumbled across one of these methods that gives an old earth. All I've got to do is bring it back in line with the Bible. But instead, we're told today to do just the opposite. We're told, you take the Bible, you run it through the strainer, through the sieve of science, and anything drops out, you can have that, you can believe it. Anything that doesn't, abandon it. No thank you, folks. That is the cart before the horse. Let me show you what I mean. How old was the earth supposed to be in the time of Charles Darwin, scientifically? Anybody know? I do. You can check it in history. The earth in the time of Charles Darwin was 20 million years old, scientifically proven to be that. How old is the earth scientifically today supposed to be? 4.6 billion. You figure it out. That means scientifically, every 15 to 20 years, the average age of the earth has doubled. Does that tell you anything about the methods we're using? Friends, I wouldn't give you a plug nickel for a whole bushel basket of them. And where this came from? There is no price you could give me to give it up. You would have to pry this book, the Word of God, out of my dry, dead hand before I will relinquish it. It is not ever going to change. Isn't that what Jude meant, the only chapter he wrote in the New Testament, when he said in verse 3, contend earnestly for the faith, once for all delivered? Friends, it isn't going to double or triple in the next 15 or 20 years. It's God's Word. If you had just bought a brand new car and it was sitting in your driveway and you'd never had a car like this before, and you opened up the door and it's got levers and switches and buttons galore, and you don't have a clue what most of them do, where would you go to find out? The owner's manual over in the glove box. I'd like to suggest to you, if you want to know something about this earth, why don't you try out the owner's manual? It's utterly amazing, the information that it contains. What was it Peter said? That pertains unto life and godliness. Not just godliness. Life. Every day, day by day, life and godliness. The one point I'd like to get across to you, and especially to our youngsters today, is this. If you plant your feet in this book, you learn it, you read it diligently, you study it, you let those roots grow deeper and deeper the older you get. The most rabid atheistic professor in the world can sit and rain down on you in the most prestigious university this country has to offer, and that stuff that he's raining on you will run off like water off a duck's back. Because you know the Creator and Maker. And you're not interested in false theories that are man-made. You're interested in one day knowing how to go to heaven. This book is the only thing that will take you there. treasure it. Cherish it. Hold it close to your heart and never give it up. Thousands before you have done just that same thing. And thousands of us after shall continue. It is His Word. And Isaiah said in chapter 40 and verse 8, the flower will wither, the grass shall fade, but the word of your God shall abide forever. I'd like to express my deep gratitude to all of you tonight for coming. You have been so gracious, so kind, so attentive. I'm well aware that the mind can only absorb what the feet can endure. And you have endured mightily today. I'm grateful to you. Tomorrow, at the Bible class hour in this auditorium, I'm going to be dealing with the topic, scientific evidences for the Bible's inspiration. I'd like to show us, especially our youngsters, some of those tiny pearls of scientific knowledge that the writers of the Bible had all along, tucked them in the dry leaves and pages of our books, but we never even knew they were there, never discovered their accuracy until relatively recently. And they are astonishing in their information. At the last lecture in the series, the sermon tomorrow morning, I'm going to be presenting a lesson entitled The Effect of Evolution Upon the Home, Church, and Nation. It is a no-holds-barred look at what has happened to the nation that we love so dearly, the church that is so precious to us, and even our own homes, because of the unchallenged teaching of evolution in this country and in the public schools. I hope you'll come. I will do my best to instruct you and to edify you, and hope that you will be intrigued by what you hear.